session we have is Mr. Lear and the Life of Art and Nonsense. Jenny Uglow in conversation with Christopher D. Hamel. I would like to welcome Christopher D. Hamel and Jenny Uglow, please.
Ladies and gentlemen, how pleasant to read Mr. Lear. Jenny Uglow has published enough for her style to be vivid and clear and filled with astonishing stuff. Jenny Uglow is a rare figure in a literary event like this because she is both a publisher and an author. She was editorial director of Chatto and Windus, one of the great British publishers, until 2013. Her first great book was the Macmillan Dictionary of Women, published in 1982, which is still in print. And she's really a biographer and cultural historian. It goes beyond merely the lives of people, but the lives of the times in which those people lived. And she has written on writers such as George Eliot and Elizabeth Gaskell and Henry Fielding, and on scientists, the best-known book being The Lunar Men, about those 18th century figures, and on artists such as Hogarth and Bewick. And all three of these come together in her great book on Edward Lear, which I have here. Edward Lear is a complex figure, as we will discover, who was a writer, and Jenny takes him very seriously as a writer, talking about his limericks, and her book is punctuated with poetry and limericks by him all the way through. So he was he's probably best known now as a writer. He was also a scientist. He would have seen himself initially as an ornithologist, and Jenny's book is arranged around aspects of the way birds behave, the flying, the sweeping, the swooping, the cheeping, the nest building, and so on, so that it has a scientific and natural history theme running through her book. And Lear himself would have seen himself as an artist. He was primarily, in his own estimation, he was primarily a painter. Jenny says in her book, and presumably when she was writing it, in the year 2012, The Owl and the Pussycat was voted the most popular poem in English history. Now, this may be a terrible indictment on the English and on their literary taste, but Jenny discusses the poem, and as a work of literature, she talks about its kind of dark side, the slithers of darkness she refers to, and this odd pairing of the bird and the cat, the two natural enemies, and their strange kind of love affair. And my first question to her is really, tell us a little bit about The Owl and the Pussycat, and is it a work of literature?
Well, I think it certainly is, but more important is it's given huge enjoyment to people all over the world for a long time. But this is, I put up this as the first slide because this is Lear when he was 47, and he's painted by his great friend, the pre-Raphaelite artist Holman Hunt. And I put up the cover of my book, which looks very vain, but if you see the writing on it, near the parrot, it says the parrot is called Layla, and she lived with Mr. Vigors in Chester Terrace. In other words, for Lear, every species, every being, every creature is a real individual, and we're not above the animals and the birds. But The Owl and the Pussycat is definitely, I think, why we remember him most. And it is wonderful. It's known all over England. It's recited and sung at weddings and feasts. And to my joy, just the other day I was here, 2 days ago, and I met Anu, who is in the audience now, and said something about Lear. And you immediately said, "Oh, let us be married. Too long we have tarried, but what shall we do for a ring?" So it's a poem that has gone around the world. And if we think of it, the Owl and the Pussycat went to sea in a beautiful pea green boat. That's absolutely a Lear adjective. Pea green, he loves that. But so you see the little boat, not just any boat, but like a jewel on the great ocean. They took some honey. They're having their honeymoon before they get married. It's upside down. It's very Lear. And to be practical, plenty of money wrapped up in a £5 note. The owl looked up to the stars above and sang to a small guitar. "Oh, lovely pussy, oh pussy, my love, what a beautiful pussy you are. You are. What a beautiful pussy you are." And there, of course, they go away and they meet the piggy with the ring in his nose and the turkey who lives on the hill, and they get married and they dance by the side of the sand. But the thing about that the poem does is it's very practical, it's down to earth, and yet it's that everybody can look up to the stars above and sing and dream. And in our imagination, all those boundaries between owl and cat and time and things can be overcome. So we can actually think of everybody, as it were, joining, mingling, male, female. We don't quite know who's male and who's female. We know that Owl is sort of seems to be leading the way, but then it's the Pussycat who says, "Let us be married," you know, which is which. And I think that that's why it's, if not a great work of literature, that's why it's such a lasting work. But Lear didn't think of it as a great poem. He just wrote in his diary, he didn't write, "I've written a song that will last for a century." He just went over to the Simmons at 3:30 with a picture poem for little Janet. You know, and that was a little girl who was ill. And Lear wrote a lot for children, and he speaks directly to children. And this poem, because children loved it, I just show another draft. That looks very different, doesn't it? This is Lear writing out The Owl and the Pussycat for another child, a little girl who was about 12, who loved it, and who said, "Please write it out for me." Children loved watching him draw and watching him write, and they often said if he did drawings and limericks while they were there, that they were quite upset when it was published in a book because they thought it was their poem. But the other thing about this draft, which is in the university at Harvard now, is if you look, can you see at the bottom, see how many figures are dancing? They're all dancing, all four of them. But when Lear came to publish it, I think it's a stroke of genius. He just drew, he didn't have that picture in it. He just leaves us with the owl and the pussycat, hand in hand, dancing forever on the edge of the sand under the light of the moon. And that remains an image, I think, that stays with us. And that's part of the reason that we love it still.
You say that he loved children and that he was good with children, but the impression from your book is that his own childhood was not particularly happy, that he was mostly brought up by his elder sisters. He suffered throughout his life from epilepsy and a conviction that he was very ugly. You hint, you don't quite say, nobody says quite, but you hint that there's what we might call child abuse in there somewhere, or some rather black aspect of his childhood. Do you think that a difficult and possibly unhappy childhood turned him into the court jester or turned him into creating an imaginary and beautiful world under the stars? Or am I misunderstanding the childhood?
No, I think that's quite right. I think it was important, and I think that this is his family to begin with were quite well off. They lived in this nice sort of villa on the outskirts of London, and he's born just at the very end of the Napoleonic Wars. But after that, there was a great financial crash, and Lear's father, who was a minor broker on the stock exchange, lost all his money, so they had to move out. And it's when they moved back into the house that Lear's mother really hands him over at the age of 4 to his older sister, Anne, who's 21, to bring him up. He wasn't Anne's child. Sometimes you find that and you think, oh, you know, it's because it's her child, really, and it's a secret. But that wasn't the case. But I think that you can understand, perhaps, why Mrs. Lear did it. She might have been a bit tired, because he was the 17th of 18 children. He liked to say he was the 20th of 21, because it sounds sort of more romantic. And he was brought up by his sisters, and really he had an absolute classic girls' education. He learnt to sketch, he learnt to play the piano, he played the piano, the flute, the guitar, and he learnt, and they read much poetry together. He adored Byron, and they read stories. But you feel that sense also. He was very frail, and this little epileptic boy, he felt that was a bad thing in those days. It was a sort of stigma. It kept you apart. It was associated with the demon, the devil, with darkness. And all his life he kept that secret. So he is slightly on his own. I think you understand his sense of escape. One of his favorite books was Gulliver's Travels. Another was the sort of stories of shipwreck and so on. And here, I think, when Anne painted him when he's 9, she's put him in a sort of magical landscape, it's a sort of Robinson Crusoe landscape. And he's holding his flute as if he can tame the beasts. And that's a kind of dream world that stays with him all his life. So I think it is important.
You describe him as having what you call a girl's education, or 19th century girl, in which painting and sketching and music were very much part of what they were taught. He was never taught to be an artist. It was rather the idea, the fashion, that painting flowers was what girls did, and natural history, animals and birds, was acceptable for boys. And out of this rather girlish world, as I understand it, he moves into natural history, which was acceptable for a boy, and at an extraordinarily early age, really in his teens, he gets involved with the parrots in London Zoo, just opened, and then through his involvement with the zoo, into the household of its patron, the Earl of Derby at Knowsley, and his painting really becomes a natural history painter of parrots. There are several strains here which are going to be in my question. One is that here's a man of relatively humble origin. Jenny's just described his father as being a minor broker, who, by the age of the late teens, early 20s, finds himself in the household of one of the great houses, one of the great earls of England, and the social mobility of the period is something that is very, very striking. Jenny's also written a book about the Napoleonic era. She knows this extremely well. And I'm interested to ask her too, why parrots? What is it about a parrot that appealed to him? And is it because, like the owl with the pussycat, they're the only birds that can talk?
That's very nice. Yeah, he did like the parrots talking, but parrots were... he's very clever. He and Anne had to move out when he's about 14. He has to make a living. He does sketching and so on. And through a connection, he got allowed to draw in London Zoo, which had only been founded the year before, 1828. So he's 16, 17. And then he had this brilliant idea of making a whole book of plates of parrots, and that's because they're supremely fashionable. They have wonderful colours. Many people had parrots as pets, but also it's about the great exploration of the world at the time, that they were an exotic bird being brought back from all different parts of the world. And so he worked hard. The keeper in the zoo would hold the parrot, and he drew and sketched it, and they are brilliant. So David Attenborough says he thinks that Lear is the greatest natural history painter of the time. And there's a lovely point where he says he can't go to dinner with a friend because he's got to finish his work, and this great parrot is looking at him now as if to say, "Finish me." But he drew inside the parrot's cage, and in the other little sketch, you see what he also drew, the people who would be round the outside looking in, yes? So he's at one with the parrots and the birds, and he's a sort of odd creature, an exhibit too. So there are all these funny caricatures of people around him. So I think the parrot had a particular meaning, and he said actually that if he really believed in the system of, as it were, reincarnation, that he very much hoped his soul would reappear as a parrot. But he went, as Christopher said, to Knowsley. The Earl of Derby was the president of London Zoo, and they all thought, what this brilliant young boy, you know, we need him to draw for us, because the rich people were collecting exotic animals from all over the world. So they had their own zoos, their own menageries, and Knowsley actually was a huge park extending into the countryside. And so Lear drew and painted the animals that were there. But as you can see, they're not just sort of straightforward descriptive plates of animals. They've all got their own life. You can sort of feel the quivering nose of this marmot looking up there. And the person that's running Knowsley now, the curator, says that the one at the bottom, the Scops owl, is his favourite because it looks so astonished, as if to say, "Why are you taking my photograph?" You know. I think what I said at the beginning about everything having an identity, you see in these pictures, this is this scary eagle owl who really proud that you just wouldn't want to meet, you know, a kind of warrior owl. But the other is a little chimpanzee called Tommy, who was brought to London Zoo, shivery and cold, and was dressed like this and lived with the keeper of London Zoo. And like so many of the animals that they imported, didn't live very long, only lived for 6 months, and people went to go and see him. And I think that, you'd agree, if we're talking about natural history painting and portraits, that's really a portrait of a being, a creature that has a life that's equally valid to our own. So there's a very strong feeling there about the animals and the links and the sort of crossover between their lives and ours. But I think Christopher said that, you know, that life in the grand house, he's an outsider, and he's an artist. He doesn't know if he's a servant or a real thing. But the Earl of Derby said he found him eating downstairs with the housekeeper, and he said, no, you should come upstairs. I intend that you should be one of us. But of course, he's never quite one of us. And he found the life there a bit formal and stuffy, and he said he longed to eat bread and cheese and beer out of a pewter pot, and he longed for a good laugh. But he did find a good laugh at Knowsley in the nursery with the children, because it's there that he first starts writing his limericks. And here you can see the animals and birds come into his poetry too. All his poems have the drawings that go with them. And this is a wonderfully joyous one of my favourites, which is, you could think that if all the birds were coming at you, it'd be like a kind of horror film, like Hitchcock. But not at all. This young lady says, there was a young lady whose bonnet came untied when the birds sat upon it. But she said, I don't care, all the birds of the air are welcome to sit on my bonnet. Lear is welcoming to the birds, and it's joyous, but that's also very typical of the people in Lear's limericks to say, I don't care. They're willful and eccentric, and they go off on their own. But he also clearly, a lot of the drawings and the poems show how near he thinks we are to animals and birds and creatures, and also, very often, if you look at the expressions, the animals and birds think that they're a lot more sensible than the humans who are looking at them. And this one, you can see they look very similar. This is there was an old man with an owl who continued to bother and howl. So he sat on a pole and a pail and imbibed bitter ale, which refreshed that old man and his owl. And what I like about that's not just the refreshment, they look jolly pleased to have a pint, but the grammar, there's no comma, so you don't actually know which of them is continuing to bother and howl, whether it's the owl or the man. And there are many such of these, and I think the limericks in particular gave great pleasure to children all the way through.
You described the picture of both the birds and indeed the monkey as being a portrait. These are portraits of people. Lear, interestingly, as an artist, did not paint portraits of people. There are very few people in his pictures. It's a very striking thing. He's really known. He would have probably seen himself as a landscape artist. Jenny has one chapter called Mr. Lear the Artist. She says that he liked people assuming his simple definition of himself was as an artist. And I suppose our next question is going to be, before we get back onto the nonsense, was he actually a great artist? And his topographical views, in the end, were overtaken by not only photography, but other painters like David Roberts. His bird pictures are well enough known, but he's overtaken in public imagination by Audubon. His best friend, Jenny's already mentioned, Holman Hunt, had Lear right in there at the very beginning of the pre-Raphaelite movement, and he doesn't get taken up in all that. You sort of feel that he's nearly at the great end, and kind of what happened, and why, since his imagination was so extraordinary. Why are his paintings so relatively conservative? And why doesn't he paint, the Jelly Belly and the land where the bong tree grows? That is what he could have done, and he paints landscapes. Why is that?
Well, I think that when he was growing up, landscape was the genre that he really wanted to do, and the natural history painting very hard on his eyes, but he also wanted to travel, and it's a slight chicken and egg thing, because he paints landscapes of different countries and brings them back for people to choose from the sketches which they would like made up into big pictures, and that funds his next travel. So you're never sure whether he's actually painting in order to travel rather than traveling in order to paint. Again, this really kind family, the Darbys, sent him to Italy when he was 25 to train as a landscape artist, and leaving this wonderful nonsense, as it were, which would go on all his life. And the nonsense, the idea of painting the Jelly Belly or painting the young lady of Dorking with her hat, never occurred to him, because these were casual things. These were things that were just done for fun. And it wasn't until much later that friends persuaded him to have them published. But they're very passionate, before I come to the landscape again, and they are very defiant. And whereas the landscapes are for people to buy and they're what is expected, the limericks are very different and defiant, and it's like the one at the top here, where there was an old man of Whitehaven who danced a quadrille with a raven, but they said it's absurd to encourage this bird, so they smashed that old man of Whitehaven. There's always this they looking on at the side, but the they, who are the respectable kind of majority were very keen to buy the landscape. So I think it's partly that. I don't think that he thought he would be a great painter to begin with. He wanted to make a living doing what he loved. And so he went to Rome, where he studied for years. He was terribly happy. And then he travelled on, and everywhere he went, he took his sketchbook. So there are thousands of sketches, and also thousands of beautiful half-done watercolours, and those are now very, very, very highly esteemed. So in that way, people now think that he is perhaps a great artist. And he went to places that they didn't know, so south of Italy. He noticed the people. And he was one of the first people to go to Albania and to paint there. And it's very sort of dark and romantic. And then on he went to Palestine. He loved the camels, as you can see, many camels, and up the Nile to Egypt. And here there's a sort of mystery about his work, and now we think quite differently, actually. It's these sketches like the boats on the Nile, which he said were like moths, that people really love, and he wrote his own instructions on them about colour and so on, and you can read the words on the paintings like little poems, like haikus, very, very sort of intimate. But I think it is too, if I can go back to the nonsense briefly.
Yeah, please do. Yeah. As much nonsense as possible, please.
Right. Yeah. But there is something about it, about this urge to travel, which is escape. And so many of his poems, later poems, not the limericks, are about escaping, like the Jumblies, who go to sea in a sieve. And it said that, they went to sea in a sieve. They did. They went to sea in a sieve. On a winter's night and a stormy morn, they went to sea in a sieve. And all their friends say, you'll all be drowned, but they cried aloud as the sieve got round and round. We don't care, we're going in our sieve. Now a sieve has holes, it can't possibly hold water, but again it's the imagination really sort of letting free, letting you travel. There's a restlessness, an inner restlessness there. And there's an interesting thought about why he was traveling so much.
She talks about the restlessness and the urge to travel and the reasons why, and whether he's traveling in order to paint or painting in order to earn enough money to travel. But I think we haven't finished with that question. What is it? What is the great urge that makes people travel? What makes those Victorians do it? And is it some kind of personal anguish? Here's a man with a probably rather not terribly fulfilled private life. That's a delicate subject that we perhaps don't want to get onto, but at one stage he visits Mount Athos, and he looks at the lives of the monks there, and he thinks they are wasted lives. He uses the word a blank being a life that has happened when nothing is in there, and he's forever kind of filling his life and going from place to place and looking for something. And I've wondered whether you think that Edward Lear is the dong with a luminous nose, who is travelling hauntedly around the world all his life, searching in the case of the dong for the lost Jumbly girl with whom he fell in love years before and never really finds him. Is he a sort of haunted ancient mariner type or wandering Jew in his travels?
Yes, there is. I think there is a sense of a restless searching for something, and certainly he is a bit like the dong with the luminous nose. He also was searching for personal happiness. It's very difficult with Lear. He doesn't talk about his sex life. He doesn't talk about his fantasies, but the people he loved were young men, and he I think genuinely fell in love with this young man, Franklin Lushington, who came from a much more intellectual family, friends of the Tennysons and so on, and he persuaded Frank to get a job or take a job as a judge in Corfu, and Lear went out to Corfu with him, painting beautiful scenes of it. But it was a relationship which didn't really work. They couldn't really be a couple. They were friends for life, but Lear was still on his own. And then he thought he'd get married, and he tried to propose a family to a wonderful woman called Gussie Bethel, a writer, and the family kept having him down to stay, expecting him to propose marriage to her, and he just couldn't do it. He couldn't do it. He couldn't do it. So that clearly wasn't for him. So he drew back, and then he is really on his own, as it were, travelling around. In the end, in 1870, he settled in San Remo, just across the border from France to Italy. He enjoyed doing his garden, and he still says he thought he was looking for a domestic hen bird, and they could settle in the, happily up an olive tree for life. But he thought, it's interesting, Lear thinks of himself as alone, but in Corfu he had taken this servant who was an Albanian, a Suliot, whose family had fled to Corfu. And that's Giorgio Coccali, who you see at the bottom here. A rather sort of fierce, indomitable, bossy, grand servant. But Lear and Giorgio travelled everywhere together. And they really were close. Giorgio looked after Lear. Lear was frantic when Giorgio was ill. His upper-class friends thought it was really most mysterious that you should bother about the life of a servant, things like that. So actually, without even recognizing it, they did have this strange couple that were going around the world together.
I don't want to dwell on this if you don't want me to, but do you assume that it was a homosexual relationship?
No, I don't think it was. I mean, I think that Lear was clearly homosexual, but I think that he never, in his younger days, he probably had liaisons with women, liaisons with men. They're not written about. But I think as he settles into his old age, it's companionship that he has, and it's always love for Frank that he would have liked to have and never quite receives the love that he really would have liked to have.
You make the very perceptive point about the Owl and the Pussycat, that even there, the great romantic love affair of literature, the best known love poem, if that is the case, you don't quite know which is the man and which is the woman. Yeah. You sort of think the Pussycat is the girl, and yet somehow it's not obvious which they are. There's a sort of the boundaries are hazy at that point.
They are.
And maybe they were for him. Lewis Carroll, of course, is another man of slightly strange private life who's fascinated by children. But I suspect, would you think Lewis Carroll is a more suspect figure in modern terms than Lear?
Oh, maybe, yes, because of the because of the way we see children and sexuality, and because Carroll was fascinated by young girls. I don't think Lear is suspect. In fact, I think Lear is... It's interesting to think about him now when we're talking about gender fluidity, and uncertainty. It wouldn't have occurred to him that, that he was a truly feminine soul. But he does in his diaries use the feminine once or twice. He says she went up here and things like that. And so sometimes it's easier for him to think of himself as a woman. So in a way, I mean, that's not something that was talked about then, but it's something that we understand a bit better now.
Yeah. Germaine Greer was talking about this here only 2 or 3 days ago, that everyone has a little element of both male and female in them. Let's come back to his nonsense. I mean, it is the nonsense, as he called it. It's really the nonsense that he is most famous for. John Ruskin, great art critic and extraordinary man for picking out artists in England, places Edward Lear among his 100 greatest authors. Yeah. It is odd.
Yeah.
Here, this may be Ruskin being controversial. But Ruskin, the art critic, sees Edward Lear, the artist, as an author. And of course, it is as an author that he is known now. Jenny has given us some examples of limericks, and I hope she can be persuaded to read us some more, if not compose one, about the girl of Jaipur. The word limerick, which perhaps we'll get you to explain, and what it has to do with Ireland, wasn't used in Lear's lifetime. The term wasn't coined until 1898. But it's really out of these funny poems develops really a strain of literature very important in the 20th century. Ogden Nash, Hilaire Belloc, and ultimately, I suppose, Dr. Seuss is a kind of literary descendant of Edward Lear. But one of the I'm coming back to this, there's a kind of element of darkness, even in these funny poems. There's a comic situation, something happens, and we then never really know who they are. They disapprove. There's always this sort of element of someone out there tut-tutting and making remarks. And Jenny really hangs the biography, oddly, cleverly, hangs the biography on limericks. They come all the way through. They've come through every answer, every question. Every question she's spoken about includes limericks. I want you to tell us a bit more about limericks and where they stand and what they mean and what he thought they meant and are they important and why are they called limericks?
Oh, I don't know why they're called limericks. I don't think anybody knows that. They were a kind of child's game. There were poems before which were moral poems about how you should live. There's a nice one in a book that Lear found at Knowsley, which gave him the idea, which is about an old lady from Norwich who eats nothing but porridge, and it's very good and upright. But the limerick for Lear is like a little box, and you get this introductory sentence. There's a very sort of simple one. There was an old man of Apulia, it's in Italy. So you have a type and you have a place, and they belong in that place, and that's all you know about it. But so there was an old man of Apulia whose conduct was very peculiar. So you know something more, he's odd. He had 20 sons whom he fed upon buns, that whimsical man of Apulia. So actually, it's tied up in a box, but if you open it, they've got this extraordinary thing, this idea of the huge family, only the buns. Is he just doing it for fun? Is it just because it's a rhyme? And there are very many of those where there's a little incident in the middle. And some of them, as Christopher has said, are jolly dark. And that quite a lot of them suggest what Lear thought about marriage, really, and about women. There was an old man of Peru who watched his wife making a stew. But once by mistake, in a cake, she did bake that unfortunate man of Peru. And the picture is of a woman with a huge big grin on her face, sort of shoveling the unfortunate husband into what looks like a pizza oven, like this, going, ha! So the poem is sort of formal, but then the picture very often is kind of gleeful. And Lear understood depression. He really, he went up to the sky and he went down. He had suffered deep depressions, and that often went with his epilepsy, which he marked in his diary. So there are some which are pretty dark, and the one, I mean, it's interesting when you read them to children, because children don't mind at all about people being bashed or stabbed or hit on the head. They're just odd people. But this was, there was an old man of New York who murdered himself with a fork, and there he is in the picture, sitting on his chair with a great fork like this. But nobody cried, though he very soon died, that unlucky old man of New York. Oh, it's very sad. It's quite grim stuff, really.
Did he compose these? I mean, is he? Are the witnesses to people? Do people describe him writing them? Would he compose them around the dinner table? Are they done quickly, or are these meditated on, like writing a little haiku or a couplet? Are they dashed off?
They're done fairly quickly, or sometimes he gets the start of one. If he's been out to dinner with some particularly irritating people in Barnes, for example, he'll say, "There was an old woman of Barnes," and then he has to think what will rhyme with it and so on. But Holman Hunt, the artist, and Tennyson remembered him going for walks, and he sort of beats out time. They're very rhythmic. That's important too, and makes them up as he goes along. So that he didn't think of them as important. I think his late songs are more serious. Yeah.
We have about 5 minutes before we're going to open it up to questions. On page 433, and she didn't know she was going to be quizzed on individual page references, she says, India was on his mind.
Yes, yes.
Tell us a bit about Lear's travels to India, and tell us a little bit about your travels and whether you, also a great traveller, whether this has affected and how in any way this touches on your view of Lear and especially Lear and India.
Yes, it's interesting thinking of Lear and India. He, there's our late poems, might come back to that. He came to, Lear and Giorgio, of course, together, came to India in late 1873, because one of his patrons was Lord Northcote, who had taken over briefly, as the sort of governor, and Northcote invited Lear, who'd known Lear had a romantic view of India, to come and stay with him. But Lear came and he realised he couldn't stand the vice-regal fuss. Much fuss in hustle fussle bad, he would say. He said, please can Giorgio and I just travel around. So for 14 months he travelled, crisscrossed all across India, from north to south, from east to west. He went in carriages, he went in bullock carts, he went in doolies, he went in jampans, he went in all forms of transport.
Did he come to Jaipur?
No, I can't see that he did. He sort of bypassed. His first thing he was heading for Lucknow, where Northcote was. So he went straight from Mumbai up to Kanpur and Lucknow and Delhi. And so Delhi and Agra, but not our wonderful Jaipur. I've been longing. My husband and I have been trying to make up limericks about there was an old man of Jaipur, but we haven't got that far. But the Lear, and this of course is where it overlaps with me and so many British visitors here and from other countries too, the moment that he stepped ashore was overwhelmed by the colour and the sound and the amazing mixture of ancient histories, ancient temples. He went right down to the south too, to the temples and shrines of the south, and a sort of vibrant, busy life. You know, people carrying around parts of machines and beautiful people in wonderful saris and colours doing the work. And because they were travelling not in a vice-regal procession, they did stay. They stopped in the bungalows, the dak houses on the corners, and they went more into the cities and into the villages than other visitors. But yes, if I go back, and he also, these are these very fast sketches he did. The first was because Giorgio had always wanted to see an elephant. So as soon as they stopped and they looked down at the river and he drew a herd of elephants. But there's also that idea of the quest. So the marble rocks here on the Narmada River were for Lear amazing and wonderful, and that was the kind of thing he wanted to see. This is Tollygunge in Kolkata. I gather now a centre of the film industry or something. But at that point, villages with sheets hanging out to dry, marshy scene. And then, too, this sense of magnificence and an ancient landscape as well as ancient buildings at Gwalior. So he did go round, and he, I think, found perhaps just the trees. He did a whole album, which was recently published, of Indian trees. As you said, going back to his interest in botany. He loved the trees, and of course he loved the birds. Everywhere he went, he would notice the birds. And then finally he went up to Darjeeling. And I think in terms of art or an artistic thing, if we talk about the sublime, things that fill you with fear and beauty at the same time, this is in a funny way where Lear found an end of that quest that you've mentioned, because he thought the mountain was stupendous, and as if it was a place of God. Now, he's not a religious man, but this to him was. And so the way that he paints it with this great V is as if you're approaching the mountain, and then he's put a little Buddhist shrine, as it were, in the side of the picture, as if to say that India for him was also a spiritual place, a place that finally rewarded that quest for the magic land. I mean, he got tired, he got hot, he got cross, but he found that here as well.
There are clearly thousands of these sketches. Where are they now? What happened to them?
The fate of Lear's, there are thought to be at least 10,000 drawings, and just quick, because it's like somebody keeping a diary, and then many more of the little watercolours. And nobody thought much. You could, if you think of this as being painted in 1875, in a very short time we're going to have completely new artistic movements, the Impressionists and so on, and this is old-fashioned. So Lear work kind of fell out of favour, and his portfolios were divided up, and there are sort of three avenues. One is many of the families who had bought his paintings. He was very generous. He would give them the sketches. So many families have sketches and have paintings and watercolours, and those have slowly come back onto the art market. The other was the really big patrons, like Lord Northcote. As a thank you, Lear would give him... There was a time when Lear was very broke towards the end of his life, and he thought he would send all his drawings to London to sell. And Northcote, who was visiting him at the time in San Remo, said, no, don't do it, and I will give you, £400 or something like that. And in return, Lear gave him a whole load of sketches, 500, and they're beautifully bound in great big books in Liverpool Public Library. Wonderful, and not many people see them, so I hope they will do something with them. The other thing that happened was just that they just sort of floated around, and they appeared in second-hand shops and so on. And in, I think, the 1950s, when you could buy them for a few pounds, alas, now cost thousands, two big American collectors began collecting them. So, and the big collections are of landscape drawing. There are nearly 3,000 in Harvard, which are in the Horton Library in Harvard, which you can see digitally.
We're going to hand it over to public questions in a moment, but can I just end up with one short sort of conclusion, is that if we take as our kind of theme throughout The Owl and the Pussycat, here is Lear, who begins with birds, with parrots, and he ends his life with a pussycat. His companion, Foss, his cat died at a good old age, and Lear was convinced that the cat was 30 years old. How did that happen? And tell us just a little about Foss, and then we'll take questions.
Foss was... Lear was given a cat by a neighbour, which disappeared. And then he got his brother, Foss. So it was sort of means Foss, like that. Foss followed him everywhere, as it were, like this. And he did wonderful drawings of him. And he became a sort of symbol of Lear. So people had to be very kind to Foss too. And I put him here with the poem about how pleasant to know Mr. Lear, who has written such volumes of stuff. Some think him ill-tempered and queer, but a few think him pleasant enough. It was written as a joke when a friend's daughter said to Lear, I had someone around the other day and they said, how pleasant to know Mr. Lear. So Lear went back and he wrote it sort of comically and a bit generously. And he says at the back about himself, physically as it were, he has ears and 2 eyes and 10 fingers, leastways if you reckon 2 thumbs. Long ago he was one of the singers, but now he is one of the dumbs. Well, I don't think we think he is one of the dumbs. He's still singing to us today, as it were. But the photos I put there, which was just really a few months before he died. So it's the last photo. And you know when they take Victorian photographs, you have to sit very, very straight and wait a very long time. And the reason that Lear is sitting like that with his arm on the edge of the chair was that Foss was supposed to be in the photo too, but just at the last minute, before the shutter went down, Foss leapt over the arm and disappeared. And I like that photo because it says, as a biographer, really, you can't catch everything. And there's always going to be a kind of Foss that disappears. Yeah.
We have 10 minutes left. Let's take questions and limericks from the audience. There's a man in the front row here who's had his hand up before.
Did he write any limericks while I was in India, particularly about India? And if you can tell us something, some limericks on India. Maybe
yes.
an elephant or a cat or I don't know, elephant. Elephant or a snake or something like that.
He did. But the only one I can remember was one that he went on when he went up to Narkunda, right, from I don't know, Delhi or somewhere, and it was a 4 days train journey, and he got very, very bored. And so he wrote bad limericks with terrible rhymes. And one of when there was an old man of Narkunda who bought a small puppy to bark under, and they sat on a tree and went very far. That had a happy old man of Narkunda. But actually he loved India. He didn't write limericks. He wrote a poem. He loved the language, as you can imagine, because he's a great feeling for the sounds of language. So he wrote a strange poem, which I can't quote because I can never remember it, using all the Indian words in a conventional way. So it begins, she sat upon her dobi, and it has kamat and things like that. And every word is used wrong. So only if you know the language would you know how nonsensical the poem is.
And is the Akond of Swat set in India?
Before he came, yes.
Let's take another question. The man.
Firstly, how delightful it is to be here on a Monday afternoon talking about Edward Lear and nonsense with the two of you. I had a question about Foss, but Christopher preempted me. So I'm going to ask an alternative question. What really motivated Edward Lear? Because there was so much depression, sadness, illness in his life, and yet he was so prolific. Was he a man of great ambition? Was he seeking some sort of literary and artistic immortality? What really drove him?
I don't know. That's interesting about artistic immortality. Because I think that he had hoped when he started out to be a landscape painter that he would be recognized. Like so many painters of the time, Turner was his idol. So, to create something new that was like Turner would be been wonderful. And he realized that he couldn't quite do that. That wasn't quite what he was doing. And so he sort of abandoned ideas of great immortality. He did show at the Royal Academy, and he was well known. And then when the nonsense came, this is a strange thing because he hadn't taken it seriously, and then he realised that was a great gift, as it were. He said after Ruskin said that he was his favourite poet, Lear said that the thought of having made 2,000 or 3,000 children laugh is really the greatest thing that you can have. So he might have been motivated by ambition and things like that, but in the end, it took quite a long time for him to recognise where his real genius lay. Yeah, it's lovely.
Thank you. Morning, what a wonderful talk, and I really appreciate
Thank you.
learning about Lear, because he's been very popular in India, and I just wanted to ask you, how popular is he amongst the young people of Britain today? Do they study him in schools?
Yes.
Are his books popular?
Well, what has happened is a double thing, is that small children who have their first books with pictures in very often have books of the poems of The Owl and the Pussycat and Lear and things like that. So they grow up knowing it and hearing that lovely rhythm. But recently, just as his paintings and sketches are now valued and attract big prices and the things, so the whole idea of nonsense, of what he does with language, and also that sense of the strange way that you can turn the world upside down and relationship, has become very, very interesting to academics. So there are many people at university now who study Lear and who study nonsense, and there's a tremendous interest in that, and I think that's a very modern thing. So thank you. Yes.
A woman over here in the pink, perhaps.
Man. Yeah. Yes.
Hello. Hi. I wanted to ask, do you think there is an influence on the modern day comics and comic strips from the limericks and the sketches for children that Edward Lear made in his lifetime?
Yes. Do I think there are sort of comic strips evolved from that? I think, funnily enough, Lear does do some stories that actually are in little comic strip form. But his things are very singular. Often they just sit on their own. But the idea of the nonsensical and the defiant, that certainly comes at the start of the whole comic strip movement. So he's an idol to that group as well. Just on the edge, you think, had he realised, had he taken it a bit further, he could have done that. So thank you. Yeah.
We have about 3 minutes left. Should we take one more question?
Hello, two.
There's one just behind you.
Sukumar Rai, the father of the legendary director Satyajit Ray, was highly inspired by Edward Lear. He, in fact, wrote a book which translates to the book of nonsense. So, do you know of other vernacular poets who were inspired by Mr. Lear?
Yes, that is such an interesting question. Are there other poets inspired by Edward Lear? He was very popular with the modernist poets and people who loved Edward Lear included Elizabeth Bishop and W.H. Auden and things like that. And also T.S. Eliot, that particular age of poetry because he was doing new and different things with language, but also more modern American poets too. And it's interesting because they thought for a long time this is a writer who is undervalued. And it's because he can use language and he uses rhythm in a way that looks transparent, but is actually quite profound. The meanings of words, the relation between words, the overturning of words. He has a wonderful ear. When he wrote alphabets and drawing alphabets for children, which is also like comic strip, he often rolls the language along, the simple sound. So you have a little mouse, so, M for mouse, M, mouse, mousy, mouse, little mousy, mousy, bousy, in the housey little mouse. Seems as simple as possible, but actually it's all about the potential of language. So quite a lot of poets, yes, are inspired by him. Thank you, that's lovely.
I think that Edward Lear would have been immensely astonished and pleased to know that 200 years after his birth, he was being celebrated as an artist and a writer, and not just in Britain, but in India, of all places. Yes. And I think on behalf of Lear and all of you, I would like to thank Jenny Uglow for an extraordinary occasion.
Thank you, Carl. Well, thank you. It's been lovely to be here.
Thank you so much, Jenny Uglow and Christopher D. Hamel. Now, we'll be starting with our next session in a few minutes. That is the book launch for Delusional Politics.